Okay. So everyone's talking about this proposed peace plan for Ukraine,
Hmm.
right? But we want to actually understand it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Go deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to hear the headlines, but quite another to grasp what it would actually mean, for people on the ground for the future of the region.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to do today. Dive deep, unpack the details, and figure out what the potential consequences of this thing could be. You with me?
I'm with you. Let's do it.
Awesome. So to set the stage a little bit, before we get into the specifics of the plan itself, I think it's important to understand the context, what's actually happening in Ukraine right now.
Mhm.
Because that's going to shape how this whole peace plan plays out.
Right. It's all about timing, too. This plan seems to be landing just as the conflict is maybe, entering a new phase.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so what's the current situation on the ground? What are we seeing?
Well, it's a mixed bag, really. You've got some areas with super intense fighting, like the Kursk region.
Right, Kursk.
Yeah.
That's been in the news a lot.
Yeah. And for good reason. The Ukrainian forces are fighting tooth and nail to hold on to this supply route. They call it the Road of Life, which tells you how vital it is.
Wow, Road of Life. That's pretty dramatic.
It is, and it shows you just how important Kursk is strategically. For Zelensky, holding on to it seems like a key part of his strategy going into any negotiations.
So he's hoping that if they can maintain control of this area, Russia will be more willing to compromise.
Exactly. He's kind of gambling on that. But then you've got other areas like Kherson where it's more of a stalemate.
Right. I've seen reports of constant shelling across the Dnipro River, but no major offensives.
Exactly. It's a war of attrition, basically, which makes it really tough for either side to make any significant gains.
Okay. So you've got this super intense fight for Kursk, a stalemate in Kherson. And then what about other parts of the country? What's happening there?
So you're also seeing smaller scale conflicts popping up in different regions. Like in the Donbass, for example, there were reports of Russian forces using these canal systems for troop movement.
Canals, like water canals.
Yeah. Apparently they're really extensive and provide a way to move troops kind of under the radar. And they're also trying to establish a big bridgehead across the Oskol River.
Okay. And what's the significance of that?
Well, if they succeed, it could be a serious threat to Kupiansk and even Kharkiv.
Kharkiv. Oh, wow. That's Ukraine's second largest city, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So taking those cities would be a huge win for Russia strategically.
It would definitely shift the balance of power. So it sounds like even though these smaller scale conflicts aren't getting as much attention, they're still incredibly important.
Yeah, they're absolutely crucial. And they're taking a huge toll on both sides in terms of casualties and resources. We're seeing Ukrainian forces defending even small villages, fiercely, just to avoid another situation like Avdiivka, where they ended up having to cede ground.
Right. They're learning from their past experiences, trying not to repeat those mistakes.
Exactly. And it speaks to their determination, too. There are reports of them turning abandoned industrial areas into defensive positions, using whatever they can to hold back the Russian advance.
So it's this incredibly complex and dynamic situation with different dynamics playing out in different regions. And then you drop this peace plan right into the middle of it.
Right. And it's a plan that's been crafted by U.S. think tanks at President Trump's behest. So, it's bound to be controversial.
For sure. So let's actually break down the plan.
Yeah.
What are the key elements here? What are the main things it's calling for?
Well, the first big thing is a ceasefire, and a pretty immediate one at that. It calls for a ceasefire by Easter.
Easter. Wow. So that's April 20th. That's not very far off.
No, it's a very tight timeline, and it's already raising eyebrows. Some people see it as a way to pressure Zelensky into making a decision quickly.
Oh, I see, forcing his hand a bit.
And exactly. Others see it as a strategic move, appealing to the religious sentiments of both sides, framing the ceasefire as this gesture of peace and goodwill, especially with it being Easter.
Interesting. Okay, so ceasefire by Easter. What else?
Another major point is that Ukraine would have to agree to not join NATO.
Ah, yes. That's been a sticking point for Russia all along, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been one of their main demands from the start, so it's not surprising to see it included in the plan.
But it does raise some questions, doesn't it? How does that square with all the talk we've been hearing from the West about Ukrainian sovereignty and self-determination?
It's a valid point. Some argue that it's a necessary concession to achieve a larger goal, peace and stability in the region. Others see it as a betrayal of Ukraine and a sign that the West is caving to Russian pressure.
So there's a lot of debate about that aspect.
Yeah.
Sure. What else does the plan cover?
Well, this is where things get even more complicated. The plan also says that Ukraine would have to recognize Russian sovereignty over the territories that Russia currently controls.
Whoa. Okay, that's a big one. What would that actually mean on the ground?
Well, for starters, it would mean that Ukraine would be formally ceding a pretty significant chunk of its territory to Russia.
Right. And that's going to be a tough pill to swallow for Zelensky and the Ukrainian people.
Absolutely. And it also raises a ton of questions about the future of the people living in those territories. What rights and freedoms will they have? What will their status be? It's a huge unknown, and one that's going to be a source of tension and uncertainty for years to come, most likely.
Yeah, it's like opening up a whole new can of worms.
Mhm.
So we've got the ceasefire, the NATO exclusion, the territorial concessions. What else is in this plan?
Well, there's also the question of a peacekeeping force. The plan calls for a European peacekeeping force to be deployed, but it specifically says that U.S. troops would not be involved.
Interesting. Why do you think they made that distinction?
Well, it's sparked a lot of debate. Some see it as a sign that the U.S. is trying to distance itself from the conflict. Maybe they're hesitant to get too deeply involved, or maybe they're prioritizing other global concerns.
So basically, they want to avoid getting dragged into another protracted military engagement.
Exactly. Others argue that it's actually a way to empower European nations, encouraging them to take on more responsibility for security in their own region.
So like a passing of the torch in a way.
Right. But either way, it raises questions about the long-term U.S. commitment to this peace process and what it means for European security as a whole.
And of course, there's the question of money. I mean, rebuilding Ukraine is going to be an incredibly expensive undertaking.
It is. The plan mentions EU funding for reconstruction, but that's going to be a massive financial burden. Are European nations really prepared to make that kind of investment?
Yeah.
Especially given the current economic climate and ongoing energy crisis?
Right. And even if the money is there, it raises questions about oversight and accountability.
Yeah.
How do you make sure those funds are actually used effectively and transparently, especially in a region that's struggled with corruption in the past?
That's a key point. It's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about building a system that's transparent, accountable, and resilient to corruption. And that's a much tougher challenge.
Yeah, it's going to require a lot of careful planning and oversight. And basically every element of this peace plan, every little detail is packed with complexities and potential pitfalls.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. Peace building is never easy, especially in a conflict as complex and deeply rooted as this one. But before we get too lost in all the what ifs and maybes, I think we need to take a step back and look at how this plan is actually being received.
Good point. So what are people saying? What are the initial reactions from Ukraine and Russia?
Well, Zelensky's office has come out pretty strongly against the plan. They're calling it a non-starter and insisting that any negotiations have to involve Ukraine directly with no preconditions.
Yeah, I can understand that perspective.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine any peace agreement working if it doesn't take into account the desires and concerns of the Ukrainian people themselves.
Absolutely. And Zelensky himself has been very vocal about the importance of European involvement. He's made it clear that Ukraine sees its future as being aligned with the West.
Okay, so a lot of resistance from Ukraine. What about Russia? How are they responding?
Their response has been a bit more measured, at least publicly. They're saying they're open to negotiations, but they want to see concrete actions from the U.S., not just words.
So they're basically saying, show us you're serious.
Exactly. Maria Zakharova, a spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, said it's too early to even talk about negotiations until there's more clarity on what specific steps the U.S. is willing to take.
So basically, both sides are approaching this with a lot of skepticism.
Yeah, there's a lot of wait and see right now. And it's important to remember that this is just a proposal at this point. It's a starting point for discussion, not a done deal.
Right. There's still a lot of room for negotiation, and things could change drastically between now and when any final agreement is reached.
Absolutely. This is just the opening act. We've got a long way to go.
Okay, well, this is fascinating already, but we're just scratching the surface here. We need to dig deeper into the potential consequences of this plan, both for Ukraine and for the wider world.
Agreed. There are a lot of big questions to unpack. Like, if this plan is accepted, does it actually lead to de-escalation? Or does it just create new problems?
Yeah, what are the risks of pushing for such a quick resolution? I mean, are we sacrificing long-term stability for the sake of a short-term ceasefire?
All excellent questions. And to really answer them, I think we need to get a clearer picture of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Like, those details matter. They can help us understand the complexities of this conflict and the challenges of actually achieving a lasting peace.
Okay, I'm all for that. Let's delve into those details and see what else we can uncover.
It's crazy when you start looking at the actual situation on the ground in Ukraine. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in all the talk about peace plans and negotiations.
Yeah, totally. But like the reality for the people who are actually living through this conflict is so much more complicated.
Exactly. Like, We've been talking about these big strategic goals, but what about the day-to-day realities? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So, like, what are we seeing on the ground?
Yeah.
What are some of the details that maybe aren't making the headlines?
We'll take the Kursk region, for example. We talked about that supply route they call the Road of Life.
Right. It's like a lifeline for the Ukrainian forces there.
Exactly. And both sides are fighting so hard for control of it because it's just that strategically important. And it's not just about these large-scale battles either. The sources are indicating that even small villages are becoming like major points of contention.
Why is that?
It seems like the Ukrainian forces are determined to avoid another situation like what happened in Avdiivka, where they had to give up ground and ended up in a weaker position. So they're basically fighting for every inch of territory, even if it doesn't seem strategically significant on the surface.
They're trying to prevent Russia from gaining any kind of foothold.
Exactly. Every inch matters in this fight. And then there are a couple of other interesting trends that I'm noticing from the sources.
Like what?
Well, for one, it seems like the pace of the Russian advance has slowed down in recent months.
That's interesting. I hadn't really noticed it.
Yeah, the average number of assaults per day has decreased, which suggests that they might be running into some logistical challenges or that their troops are just exhausted. You know, a war of this intensity takes a toll.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And on the Ukrainian side, it seems like they're adapting and innovating constantly.
Yeah, there are all these reports of them using abandoned industrial areas as defensive positions, basically turning scrap metal and rubble into fortifications.
It's like a modern-day version of siege warfare.
Right.
Yeah.
It's pretty remarkable. And it speaks to the resourcefulness and determination of the Ukrainian forces. They're constantly having to adjust their tactics and come up with creative solutions to overcome the challenges they're facing.
I'm also curious about the weapons and technology being used. Are we seeing anything new or particularly noteworthy?
Yeah, actually, the sources mention some pretty sophisticated tech being deployed, especially by the Ukrainians. We're seeing reports of them using drones packed with explosives to strike targets deep inside Russian territory.
Wow. So it's not just about front lines anymore. It's about vulnerabilities far behind those lines.
Exactly. And that's creating a whole new level of anxiety for people living in those areas. There have even been reports of North Korean troops fighting alongside the Russians, which just adds another layer of complexity and uncertainty to the situation.
That's pretty unsettling, to be honest. And it makes you wonder about the human cost of all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about casualties, obviously, but what about the broader impact on the people of Ukraine?
Well, the sources paint a pretty grim picture. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes, either internally or as refugees in neighboring countries. The psychological impact is profound. People are living in constant fear and uncertainty. And sadly, there are also reports of corruption, with some local authorities exploiting the chaos for personal gain.
So even in the midst of war, you still have greed and self-interest rearing their ugly heads.
It's a sad reality, but it's a reminder that this conflict is affecting people on so many different levels. It's not just about military objectives and political maneuvering. It's about real people's lives being shattered.
It's easy to lose sight of that when you're looking at things from a distance.
It is, and that's why it's so important to keep digging deeper to try to understand the full scope of what's happening.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the situation on the ground, but let's circle back to President Trump's peace plan for a moment.
Okay, sounds good.
We've covered the ceasefire, the NATO exclusion, the territorial concessions, but there are a couple of other elements I want to unpack.
Sure. What do you think about?
Well, the plan calls for a European peacekeeping force, but it specifically says that U.S. troops would not be involved. What do you make of that?
It's definitely sparked a lot of debate. Some people see it as a sign that the U.S. is trying to distance itself from the conflict.
Like they're hesitant to get too deeply involved.
Right. Maybe they're worried about getting dragged into another long-term military engagement. Or maybe they just want to shift the focus to other global priorities. But others argue that it's actually a way to empower European nations, encouraging them to take on more responsibility for security in their own region.
It's like a strategic move to strengthen European alliances.
Exactly. But either way, it raises questions about the level of U.S. commitment to this peace process and what it means for the future of European security as a whole.
And of course, there's the question of who's going to pay for all of this.
Right. Rebuilding Ukraine is going to be incredibly expensive.
The plan mentions EU funding, but that's a massive financial burden.
Yeah.
Are European countries really prepared to make that kind of investment?
It's a lot to ask, especially given all the other economic challenges they're facing right now. And even if the money is there are still questions about oversight and accountability.
Yeah, how do you make sure those funds are actually used effectively and transparently, especially in a region with a history of corruption?
That's a crucial point. It's not just about pouring money into infrastructure projects. It's about creating a system of governance that's transparent, accountable, and resilient to corruption. And that's a much more complex and challenging undertaking.
It seems like every aspect of this peace plan, every little detail is just riddled with complexities and potential pitfalls.
It's true. Peace building is rarely straightforward, especially in a situation as complicated as this one. But I think it's important to remember that this is just a starting point. This peace plan is a proposal, a framework for discussion. It's not a final agreement.
Right. There's still a lot of room for negotiation and compromise.
Exactly. And I think the key takeaway here is that peace building is a process. It's not something that happens overnight. It requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations.
And a willingness to acknowledge the complexities and nuances of the situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we keep talking about this frozen conflict thing, and it honestly kind of freaks me out. Is that really the best case scenario here? Like just hitting pause on the fighting, but not actually solving anything?
It's definitely a valid concern, and it's not a scenario we should take lightly. I mean, a frozen conflict would basically leave Ukraine in the state of permanent limbo.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be able to fully rebuild or move forward. And there would always be this underlying tension and anxiety, like the threat of violence would always be there.
It just seems like setting ourselves up for failure down the road. Like we're kicking the can down the road and hoping for the best, but it's probably going to come back to bite us.
And the thing is, the issues at the heart of this conflict, they're not simple. They're not going to just magically disappear. We're talking about historical grievances, competing national identities, a clash of geopolitical ambitions between Russia and the West. These are deep-seated issues.
So how do we prevent that frozen conflict scenario from becoming Ukraine's reality? Like, what can we actually do?
Well, it's going to take a lot of effort on multiple fronts. For starters, we need ongoing diplomatic engagement. Like, we can't just give up on dialogue, even when it gets tough. And we need to be willing to explore creative solutions that address the core concerns of all sides involved.
I mean, that's easier said than done, right? We're seeing how hard it is to even get Russia and Ukraine to sit down at the negotiating table, let alone agree on a path forward.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge challenge. But history shows us that even the most intractable conflicts can eventually be resolved through diplomacy and compromise. The key is to keep that long game in mind, to focus on building trust, even if it's just little by little, and to work towards a future where cooperation, not conflict, is the norm.
I like that. Okay, so diplomacy is key. But what about the issue of accountability? Like, we can't just forget about the atrocities that have been committed. There has to be justice for the victims.
You're absolutely right. Accountability is crucial, not just for the victims and their families, but for the future of Ukraine and for the whole idea of a rules-based international order. I mean, if we allow war crimes to go unpunished, it sends a really dangerous message. And it just increases the likelihood of more violence happening down the road.
But how do you even achieve justice in the middle of a war? Like, how do you gather evidence and conduct investigations when the fighting is still going on?
It's not easy, that's for sure. It requires meticulous documentation, careful preservation of evidence, and the establishment of credible legal mechanisms. And it demands impartiality, too, like a real commitment to due process, regardless of which side the accused is on.
And let's be real, these kinds of investigations are almost always politicized. It can be really hard to separate fact from propaganda, especially when emotions are running so high.
That's why it's so important to have independent, internationally recognized bodies involved, like the International Criminal Court. They've already opened an investigation into the situation in Ukraine, and they play a vital role in ensuring that justice is pursued fairly and transparently.
Okay, that gives me some hope, at least.
Yeah.
That those who are responsible for these atrocities will eventually be held accountable.
It's a long process, and there are definitely going to be challenges along the way. But the pursuit of justice is essential both for the victims and as a deterrent to future crimes.
So we've talked about the need for diplomacy and accountability. But what about the bigger picture? Like, what does this war mean for the future of NATO, for European security, for the global order as a whole? Those are some pretty big questions.
They are. And honestly, I don't think anyone has all the answers yet. But what's clear is that this conflict has shaken things up. It's exposed vulnerabilities in the international system, and it's forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the fragility of peace.
Like a wake-up call in a way.
Exactly. And it's shown us that we can't take peace and stability for granted, We need a strong and unified international community to deter aggression, uphold international law, and promote peaceful resolutions to disputes.
But the world seems more divided than ever right now. Tensions between Russia and the West are incredibly high, and other global powers like China are becoming increasingly assertive. It's hard to imagine a path towards unity and cooperation in this kind of climate.
It's definitely a challenging landscape. There's no denying that.
Aye.
But I do believe that we can learn from this conflict, and those lessons can ultimately lead to positive change.
Like what kinds of lessons?
Well, for one, it's highlighted the importance of diplomacy, like real meaningful engagement. And it's shown us just how interconnected our security really is. What happens in one part of the world affects us all. And it's underscored the need for global cooperation to address shared threats, like climate change, pandemics, terrorism. These are challenges that no one nation can solve on its own.
So you're saying that amidst all the darkness and uncertainty, there's still a glimmer of hope?
I think so. The human capacity for compassion, resilience, and the pursuit of justice, those are powerful forces. And ultimately, I believe those are the forces that will guide us towards a better future.
I like that way of thinking. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. I feel like we've covered so much ground. We went from those nitty-gritty details on the ground in Ukraine all the way to the global implications of this conflict. And I definitely have a much deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities we face as we try to find a path to peace.
That's what we aim for, to give you the context and analysis you need to make sense of these complex issues. Because the more informed we all are, the better equipped we'll be to have those tough conversations and advocate for real, lasting solutions.
Well said. And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep seeking out diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
Because peace is a process. It requires all of us to be engaged and informed.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, so on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. But don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear.